You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. During each bi-monthly episode, we'll be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic.
Love what you're hearing, but wish you could take the entire Horse Radio Network with you on the trail? Well, you can. Instead of hunting for every individual show, just search for the Horse Radio Network All Shows feed in your favorite podcast app. It's one subscription that delivers every single episode from across our entire network. From Western to English, health tips to humor, directly to your phone. Don't miss a single stride. Subscribe to the HRN All Shows feed today.
I'm your host, Hailey Pfeffer, and my guest today is Dr. Ray Smith from the University of Kentucky. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hailey, it's very good to be with you.
So our topic today is one that I think we're all thinking about by the time we hit the late summer and early fall, and that is our pasture management strategies. So could you just tell us, to begin with, as we head into this time of year, what the biggest mistakes horse owners and barn managers should be avoiding if they want their pastures to stay healthy all through the fall and then into next spring?
So the biggest mistake is the simplest one to answer, but maybe the hardest one to deal with, and that is overgrazing. Pastures that are grazed down close to the ground, the plants are stressed, there's more bare soil, there's more chance for weeds to grow. So easier to say than it is to solve, but trying to maintain a grazing height, like what I mean is not to graze closer than 3 to 4 inches on cool season pastures, or warm season pastures like Bermuda grass, not closer than 2 to 3 inches, can make a huge difference in the ability of the pasture to remain productive through the late summer and fall, and then to come back much more productive next spring.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think a lot of people might wonder why we have to start thinking about next spring already when we're only a little more than halfway through the year. So could you tell us why this is that we need to plan so far in advance for pasture management, even though we're probably still thinking about summer things with our horses?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. So let me answer first. If predominant grasses in your pasture are cool season, so that would be things like Kentucky bluegrass, fescue, like tall fescue, orchard grass, perennial ryegrass, those types of grasses. So those grasses struggle through the summer in most of the U.S. They're growing more slowly because they grow best at cool temperatures. And so they're already stressed just from the summer, even if you weren't grazing them. But then grazing them, they're under even more stress. And as you move into the fall period, so we're talking September, October, into November, depending on where you're at, those grasses really need a recovery period. They need to be able to build back the root systems that have kind of been depleted or pruned back over the summer. They need time to build up the carbohydrate reserves in the base of the stems, just getting ready for winter to survive the winter well. But then if the roots are in better shape, if the carbohydrates are built back in the base of the stem, those grasses are going to come back a lot better the next spring. The other thing that happens with the cool season grasses is that's the time of the year that the fall is the time of the year that they're producing new shoots or new tillers. In essence, getting larger and being more ready to go through the winter and being more ready for next spring. So just critical to be able to have rest periods for the pasture and not to graze too close in the late summer and fall. So they're going to not only have that covered through the winter, but they're going to come back quicker in the spring. And I've seen this over and over and over. Pastures that are hammered in the late summer and the fall, they have more weed growth in the winter. They come back slower in the spring. If you have warm season pastures like Bermuda grass, again, giving them not grazing them into the ground all winter long is going to allow them to come back better. But one of the most important things, if they're grazed down closely during that late summer fall, then there's going to be a lot more winter annual weeds coming up. So for both of those, if you can resist the temptation to stock too heavy or just to leave animals out there when it's already grazed into the ground, you're going to be better off overall, and particularly coming up next spring.
Definitely. And when we're looking at our pastures at this point in the year, how can we tell whether they're showing signs of stress from the summer heat, the drought, and like you mentioned, heavy grazing?
Yeah. So a good way to look at it is when you get a periodic rain, then or those of you that might even be watering or irrigating your pastures, look at the regrowth that happens. How fast is that regrowth? And a good comparison would be grass that may be growing along the fence line or right outside of the fence, or maybe in some areas between pastures, or even your yard after you mow it. If you're comparing your pasture, if your pasture is growing back a lot slower than maybe your yard is, or those areas outside the fence, then they're probably showing signs of stress from the heat or drought, or maybe probably more so even from heavy grazing. Looking at the amount of bare soil, when you stand in your pastures or walk across your pastures and look down a really healthy grass sod, you're not going to see very much bare soil, maybe 10 or 20%. You should be seeing green grass. So if you're seeing a lot of bare soil, or you're seeing a lot of annual weeds popping up, like a foxtail or crabgrass or things like that, then that's another sign. Crabgrass it's a useful weed, we might call it, because it's a useful forage. It's a nutritious forage, but it's so it growing is good for the horses to eat, but it's going to die out when there's frost, and so you're going to have bare soil all winter long. So it's kind of good to have for the summer, but it's an indicator that you've got bare soil for it to be able to start growing. Another thing is if your pastures are browning off here in the late summer, compared to other areas, again going back to your lawn or to the areas outside the pasture, then that's an indication that there's drought stress, that there's heat stress, that there's overgrazing. I mentioned before that kind of rule of thumb that maintaining pastures, if they're cool season grasses, 3 to 4 inches or taller, and if they're warm season like Bermuda or Bahia, 2 to 3 inches or taller is a good way to maintain those pastures.
So something that we start to talk about here in Pennsylvania around the fall time is sacrifice areas. So
Mm-hmm.
when would be a good time for people to start thinking about sacrifice areas if they're needed? And what are the consequences of waiting too long to move those horses? Because I think something that I've been guilty of before is waiting too long.
Yeah, no, very, very good question. I really recommend having a sacrifice area available year round. Now, ideally, that might be an area that you put down filter fabric and gravel and Class I sand, so that you don't have to worry about it just being mud in the winter. But having that extra paddock that you're not worried about what's growing there, or that you've made some kind of permanent cover there, then for a really good example, you're moving into the late summer. The grasses are growing back slower. You're realizing that you're not able to maintain the cool season grasses, that 3 or 4 inches. Then go ahead and move them to that sacrifice area and leave them there until you're getting past your regrowth. And that may be a month, that may be 2 or 3 months. And I've often talked to people, and I'll encourage them to use rotational grazing, to move horses from one pasture to another pasture to another pasture, giving rest in between, giving a few weeks of rest between pastures grazing. And many people will say, well, that's hard to do, or I don't have enough areas. You could use rotational grazing if you only have a sacrifice area and one main pasture. So they're in that sacrifice area and you're feeding hay for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you're moving them back onto your main pasture. So the long and the short, everyone should everyone should think about or plan to have a sacrifice area and have that available.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because I'm one who also thinks that you have to have a pretty decent amount of space to be able to do rotational grazing. And I'm
Hmm.
thinking like multiple very large pastures. So it's nice that you pointed out that we can do that even with just a sacrifice area and the pasture.
And over again, Krista Lay, who's our pasture evaluation coordinator, we're finding it's not untypical that you've got a certain number of horses and you've got a certain amount of land, and sometimes that can be more horses than the land will sustain. And you don't want to get rid of horses, and you probably can't buy more land. And so having that sacrifice area and feeding hay there when the pasture growth is slow is a very conceivable way, a very easy way to do that.
Love what you're hearing, but wish you could take the entire Horse Radio Network with you on the trail? Well, you can. Instead of hunting for every individual show, just search for the Horse Radio Network All Shows feed in your favorite podcast app. It's one subscription that delivers every single episode from across our entire network. From Western to English, health tips to humor, directly to your phone. Don't miss a single stride. Subscribe to the HRN All Shows feed today.
So let's talk about improving our pasture conditions a little bit. Can you tell us how owners and barn managers can use this time of year to improve the pasture conditions through things like reseeding? You've mentioned resting, and soil management as well. I think soil management is a big one that we forget.
Yeah, and so late summer, early fall is a great time to overseed pastures that have thinned. If it's putting cool season grasses in there to add some perennial ryegrass as a quick growth, maybe to add fescue or bluegrass or orchard grass. Then for much of the U.S., we're talking about late August and early September. As you move further south, kind of middle of the U.S. and south, then it may be getting into late September and early October. But that's the perfect time to reseed. If you've got warm season pastures like Bermuda grass, then as you move, once there's been frost or you're approaching a period of frost, then that's a great time to overseed those with the cool season annuals, like annual ryegrass. So, first of all, reseeding, fall is the perfect time to do that. Resting pastures, we've kind of already talked about that a bit, that giving rest periods when the pastures are getting closely grazed, they're going to recover better the next spring. Soil management, let me give a little bit more detail with that, because fall is a great time of the year to soil test, and actually a great time of the year to fertilize pastures. So if you do your soil test and turn that in through your local county agent or through the ag store that you work with, they can tell you what nutrients are needed. The other thing that we increasingly emphasize is that with cool season grasses, the late fall is a really good time to add nitrogen. So nitrogen is what's needed for the grass to grow, for the grass to have more chlorophyll, so photosynthesis is good, to have protein in the grass. And so quite low amounts of nitrogen. If you're applying nitrogen as urea, even 100 pounds of urea, that would be 46 pounds of actual nitrogen, can really help the grass become stronger going into the winter, can help the grass thicken up, can help the grass come back earlier in the spring. It's usually easy to get on pastures in the fall of the year. Most areas of the U.S. were drier in the fall. And so applying the fertilizers like the phosphorus and the potassium, liming if it's called for, fall's a great time to apply that. Applying nitrogen is a great time in the fall. If it's a permanent pasture, if you're not taking hay off of it, then that low application of nitrogen once a year in the late fall, we're talking about, kind of 4 to 6 weeks before things really get cold, before growth really slows down. If you're working with a warm season pasture, a Bermuda grass, then the time to fertilize that is when it's greening up in the summer. And you don't want to fertilize it in the fall because you don't want it to grow too much. You want it to be prepared for winter.
Okay, so speaking of soil, can you tell us how we can use soil testing at this time of year to make sure our pastures and the soil in them is healthy, and what common mistakes we might make when it comes to this particular aspect?
So as I just mentioned, soil testing is a great way to find out what are the nutrients needed in my pastures. And I mentioned that fall is a good time to sample. Part of that is it's good to sample the same time of the year each year because the results can vary a little bit with the moisture, damp soils that we have in the spring versus in the fall. Since fall is a good time to apply fertilizer, then that's a good time to test. Common mistakes would be going into a pasture and only taking a few samples. And then often if you're, kind of short on time, those samples might be around a gate area. A gate area is because animals can congregate there and there may be more urine and manure there. Then you can get a false high reading. It shows that you've actually got good for it. It shows that you apparently have good fertility because there's a lot of manure and urine, whereas the backside of that pasture may be quite low. So just really important to take samples from throughout the pasture. We typically say 15 to 20 samples, depending on the size. Ideally, use a soil probe. That takes like a little core out of the soil. Our recommendation in Kentucky is 4 inches deep. Some states go to a little bit deeper than that. If you don't have one of those soil cores, then a small spade or even a shovel, but just make sure that you have when you're putting into the bucket that you're sampling with, that you're getting your soil in, just make sure you got an equal amount of soil at the top as you have down at 4 inches. So you have to kind of take a slice of soil if you're doing this with a shovel. And then mix all of that up really good to put in the bag then that you're sending to the lab.
So we've talked about what we do not want to see in our pastures at this point in the year, but could you tell us what a healthy pasture or even the ideal pasture would look like as we're heading into the fall?
So it's going to be green and growing. Obviously, as long as there's moisture or after rain, it's going to be green and growing. It's going to have a low amount of weeds. And remember that weeds are plants that the animals aren't going to eat. It's not just a plant that you don't like the looks of it, because a lot of weeds can be, what we think of as weeds can be beneficial to the animals when they're in low amounts, things like plantain or dandelion. So that healthy pasture is not grazed too close, has that 3 to 4 inch height. It grows back quickly when there's rain. That healthy pasture is one that at least some of your pastures you're trying to rest through the winter so they'll come back early in the spring. There's a lot of great resources online, but I should mention a very new book called Horse Pasture Management, the second edition by Paul Sharp. If you want a lot more details on pasture management, and this is written by authors across the country, so a great resource. Kentucky and other states have publications specifically on establishing a horse pasture. One last thing I want to mention is that there's the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. They have a program called Web Soil Survey, and you can put your land, your address, and outline your farm any place in the country, and it's going to tell you the type of soil, and it's going to tell you the carrying capacity, the ideal number of horses that you should have on your farm. So great resource to use, particularly if you're moving into a new area or you're trying to make decisions on how many horses I should try to maintain on this land.
Yeah, I really like that. That's super interesting. And like you said, great for people who are moving or just opening up a new barn, something like that.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our time for today. I have one more question for you, though, and I'd like to give people a few quick takeaways if possible. So if you were speaking to a horse owner and they could only do 3 things at this point in the year to set their pasture up for success next year, what would you want them to be doing?
Great question, Hailey. I'm actually going to give 5, but my first 3 are rest, rest, rest. Giving your pasture periodic periods of rest. Then I would talk about soil testing and fertilizing the pastures to the recommendations that are given. And then the other thing would be overseeding if you're getting a lot of bare ground. And an important thing is after you overseed, it's important to give a rest period so those new little seedlings have a chance to get established. People often ask, how long should I rest? A month is better than 2 months, but 3 months is even better. So you want those seedlings to actually get some growth, to be 4 to 5 inches tall before they're grazed again. So rest, soil test, overseeding if needed.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Great so much, Hailey, and everyone out there. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management Podcast to a friend.